Ongoing migrant protests in Ireland have been branded out of control as Sinn Féin has vowed to implement a stricter immigration policy for the country. Protests have erupted at a former paint factory in Coolock as locals oppose the location being earmarked as a site to house asylum seekers.
Absolute honour of my life to formally be here with you today in Athlone to
Taoiseach Simon Harris faces increasing pressure to crack down on immigration and has called the demonstrations in Coolock reprehensible and thuggery. Sharing his thoughts on GB News, host Eamon Holmes said the immigration crisis in Ireland is out of control and warned of similar demonstrations making their way to the UK if numbers continue to surge. Joined by Irish political correspondent Ben Scallon, he claimed that the immigration issues have been ongoing for several years due to the grandiose commitment by government to having a no-cap policy when it came to asylum seekers. Scallon explained they said we will take as many as they can effectively and we're bracing to accept as many as 200,000 asylum seekers entering Ireland. For those who don't know, the Republic of Ireland's population is just over 5 million. So 200,000 in a country with a population of that size is astonishing. Noting the latest from President of Sinn Féin Mary Lou MacDonald, who claimed locals won't have a veto on who moves into their area, Eamon asks Scallon when the arrogance displayed by the Irish government is going to disappear. The Irish government's unwavering commitment to housing and feeding an unprecedented influx of migrants in the wake of a severe housing and cost of living crisis has brought the Irish electorate to boiling point. It has many similarities to the migrant crisis in the US. Hundreds of protests in towns have sprung up around the country, with people calling on the government to end what they say is an open borders, globalist agenda that is putting the needs of migrants ahead of those of its citizens, many of whom are struggling to pay for everyday items and unable to buy or rent homes as Ireland's homeless numbers skyrocket. Several high-profile crimes linked to migrants have also driven fear into the native citizenry.
Emergency services rush to a primary school where 3 children have just been stabbed.
Culminating in shocking knife attacks on young children and their teacher by an Algerian-born Irish citizen in November that triggered rioting and looting in the nation's capital. Those who want immigration laws enforced and numbers reduced say they are being ignored by the political establishment. Ireland is a tinderbox at the moment, Irish journalist Fatima Gunning told Fox News Digital. At this point, I don't think anything would surprise me. On Monday, thousands of protesters carrying Irish flags rallied in Dublin, calling for an end to mass migration and demanding that a new nationalist government take its place. Chants of "Get them out" in reference to the government echoed throughout the nation's capital, while others carried signs reading "Irish Lives Matter" and "Under Siege," invasion, large banners reading "Mass Deportations" and "End the Plantation" hung from a bridge. The protesters say they represent the silent majority of the electorate, around 75%, based on several polls, who say immigration is too high and that the country has taken in too many refugees.
That they were bracing to accept as many as 200,000 asylum seekers entering Ireland, which for those who don't know, the Republic of Ireland's population is just over 5 million, so 200,000 in a country with a population.
Scallon responded, "It's a strange misunderstanding that has arisen in not just this country, but probably many Western countries, where politicians and the political class at large seem to be under the misapprehension that they own the country, when in fact it is the citizenry of the country who own the country." Scallon fumed, "Ireland does not belong to the politicians. They are people who have been temporarily bestowed with the right to manage it on behalf of the people as representatives. And so this whole, you don't have a veto, you can't decide, well then who can decide?" Eamon weighed in on the migration crisis affecting the West, claiming that no one is able to solve it. He told GB News, "It appears that we're losing control. I don't care who you are in the world, none of us can solve the migration problem. So you've either got to decide, what are you going to do to tamper with it, or are you going to leave it alone? Are you going to put up the borders and say, I'm sorry, it's very unfortunate what you're going through, but it's not our problem, and we only take extreme cases like those people affected by war? But goodness me, it's obvious. We know we just can't control it." When asked by Anne if the situation in Ireland is going to lead to more protests against Sinn Féin, Scallon responded, "It seems like we're on that trajectory." They were warned about this in 2022 before things got out of control. They proceeded to ignore that advice and do it anyway, and now we're at a situation where we've seen multiple riots. There's these kinds of fiery scenes unfolding in working class communities all over the country, and it is just ludicrous. The Irish government has announced major changes to address the critical shortage of accommodation for asylum seekers. It said it will also overhaul its own asylum laws as it opts in to common European standards stipulated in the new Migration Pact. The dramatic shortfall of accommodation for asylum seekers in Ireland has been in the spotlight for some time. On the streets of the capital, Dublin, and throughout the country, hundreds of people are seen sleeping rough in tents, with 1,517 asylum applicants currently waiting for accommodation. According to the latest government figures, a general lack of housing, a rise in the number of refugees, most of whom are fleeing the war in Ukraine, and growing xenophobic sentiments have led to a series of anti-migrant protests across the country in recent months, including arson attacks on existing facilities used to accommodate asylum seekers. The Minister for Integration, Roderick O'Orman, said this week that the country's inability to accommodate its asylum seekers was a hugely serious situation. It's clear the current system of accommodation isn't working, he announced, adding that it had reached crisis point. More than 90% of accommodation for asylum seekers in Ireland is currently privately provided, which means the government has little control over the location and quality of facilities. Upon completion, the changes will see a total of 14,000 beds being provided for asylum seekers in state-run facilities by 2028, 4 times the number previously committed to by the government. Several sites have reportedly been identified for the new facilities to be built, and related assessments have begun, according to local news reports. The announcement was welcomed with a mixed reception. Jennifer Whitmore, a Social Democrats MP and spokesperson on integration, doubled down on calls for action from the government. We need to see the delivery of those reception centers, she stressed, while pointing out that a similar commitment regarding the use of modular homes and other accommodation facilities had already been made several years ago. Bulalani Mfako, a former asylum seeker who spent 6 years in direct provision, said the government failed to deliver on that earlier pledge, and he expressed skepticism about whether the newly announced program would make any difference to those living without shelter at the moment. I don't really see how the government's plan now actually takes the people who are living in tents outside the International Protection Office right now out of the streets, he told the Irish national broadcaster RTE. Ireland this week separately agreed to sign up to draft changes to EU migration rules known as the New Pact on Migration and Asylum. Ireland and Denmark are the only 2 countries in the EU with the option to pick and choose from the regulations. The government said it hopes that opting into the provisions of the pact will reduce overall numbers of migrants in Ireland, as more asylum seekers will then be subject to accelerated asylum and deportation procedures. The introduction of the pact also represents the biggest reform of Irish immigration law in decades, Justice Minister Helen McEntee said during a government press conference, adding that the decision would not affect the right of people in need of protection to claim asylum in Ireland. But we do have a lot of people using the international protection system who genuinely do not need it, and we have to make sure that those two are separated, she said. Human rights groups such as HIAS, however, say that according to official statistics, the majority of asylum seekers are indeed fleeing persecution and violence, contradicting McEntee's statement. The CEO of the Irish Refugee Council, Nick Henderson, said the decision to sign up to the EU Pact was very problematic. He expressed his concern about a particular provision in the pact, which the government says will be implemented in Irish law. That provision would allow for some categories of asylum seekers to be detained in closed facilities at borders for up to 12 weeks while their claim is being assessed. If somebody came to Ireland, they would be held in accommodation that they couldn't leave, and then their application would be fast-tracked and they would be asked to leave if they were unsuccessful, said Henderson.